Six Flags built itself into the largest regional theme park company in North America. It also went bankrupt, closed parks that people genuinely loved, and accumulated enough tragedy and controversy along the way to fill several very uncomfortable documentaries. This is the story of the downfall of Six Flags parks. Closures, debt, and tragedy. Part 1. Where it started and what went wrong first. Six Flags Over Texas opened in 1961 in Arlington, Texas, and it was a genuinely innovative idea. Angus Wynn, the developer behind it, had studied Disneyland and decided to build a regional alternative, a large-scale theme park close enough for families to drive to, with a single all-inclusive admission price instead of the pay-per-ride model most parks used at the time. The name came from the Six Flags that had flown over Texas: Spain, France, Mexico, the Republic of Texas, the Confederacy, and the United States. Wynn's wife, Joanne, is credited with the final name. When he proposed calling it Texas Under Six Flags, she reportedly pointed out that Texas hadn't been under anything. Adjusted, the model worked. A second park followed in Georgia in 1967, then St. Louis. Through the 1960s and 70s, Six Flags made sense. Regional parks near large population centers, consistent enough to hold an annual pass audience. The company changed hands a few times over the decades, eventually landing at Time Warner, which spun the parks off in 1998. That spin-off is where everything started tilting. A smaller operator called Premier Parks absorbed the Six Flags brand and immediately began buying everything in sight. Between 1998 and 2001, the company acquired 31 parks in roughly 4 years, parks scattered across the United States. The logic was scale. A bigger network meant bigger sponsorship deals and a brand large enough to compete with Disney on a regional level. What it actually produced was a debt load that kept growing while attendance at many of the acquired parks remained underwhelming, and a company stretched so thin it couldn't give real attention to any individual property. Analysts later described it as mania, noting the company had taken on generally weak amusement park properties it just couldn't generate value from. The company lost $122 million in the first half of 2003 alone. Debt climbed to roughly $2.4 billion against assets of around $3 billion. A structure with almost no margin and zero tolerance for any external shock. September 11th delivered the first one, cutting theme park attendance across the industry at the exact moment Six Flags could least absorb it. The European parks were sold off between 2003 and 2004, but the proceeds weren't enough. Washington Redskins owner Daniel Snyder, who became chairman in 2005, tried restructuring and cost-cutting. It wasn't enough either. In April 2009, Six Flags stock was delisted from the New York Stock Exchange. On June 13, 2009, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy with $2.7 billion in debt. Management assured customers that all parks would remain open through the summer season, the most important PR move of the whole process, reassuring families who'd bought season passes that their summers weren't being canceled. On May 3rd, Six Flags emerged from bankruptcy, with lenders taking 92% of the company in exchange for canceling $1.13 billion in debt. The old shareholders were wiped out. The new company relocated to Grand Prairie, Texas, and started the considerably less glamorous work of running a theme park company that actually had to make money. Part 2, Astroworld, the park that didn't have to die. In Houston, Texas, there is a grass field between Loop 610 and Kirby Drive where children used to scream on roller coasters. Today, it serves as overflow parking during the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. That is the legacy of Six Flags Astroworld, and the people of Houston have not entirely gotten over it. Astroworld opened on June 1st, 1968, as part of the sprawling Astrodomain complex developed by Roy Hofheinz, the former Houston mayor, who also built the Astrodome. The park was designed to be a complement to the Astrodome, entertainment infrastructure for one of America's fastest-growing cities. It was a uniquely ambitious thing to build in the heat of Southeast Texas, and it pulled it off with a level of detail unusual for regional parks of the era. Hofheinz had final approval over aspects of the park's design and used rare antiques from his personal collection to enhance the theming. The park even featured 2,400 tons of outdoor air conditioning, underground pipes carrying chilled water to queue lines, picnic areas, and retail areas across the park, with the air conditioning ducts disguised to blend into the theming. In 1968, Houston air-conditioned outdoor theme park queues were not a standard amenity. It was acquired by Six Flags in 1975 and expanded through the following 3 decades. At its best, Astroworld was genuinely beloved. The Texas Cyclone, a wooden roller coaster modeled on the legendary Coney Island Cyclone, was considered one of the finest wooden coasters in the American South. Thunder River, which opened in 1980, was widely considered the world's first successful commercial river rapids ride, the kind where guests sit in circular rafts and float through man-made rapids while getting thoroughly soaked, and was copied by parks across the country and internationally within years of its opening. Waterworld was added in 1983 and merged with Astroworld in 2002, making the combined complex a full-day destination. By the early 2000s, Astroworld ranked in the 36th to 39th range globally in annual attendance. Still substantial, still viable, not spectacular, but consistent with a mid-tier regional park, serving one of the largest cities in the United States. The park wasn't dying. It was operating in a position appropriate for its location and size. But in 2004, a contractual arrangement that had allowed Six Flags visitors to park at the neighboring Reliant Stadium expired, and the company's attempts to renew it failed. Without accessible parking, the park became functionally difficult for a large segment of visitors to reach. On September 12, 2005, Six Flags announced that Astroworld would close permanently at the end of that season on October 30th, 2005. The reasons cited included the parking problem, the age and condition of the facilities, the investment that would be required to modernize them, and the financial pressure on the company as a whole. Six Flags CFO Jim Danhauser cited the expired parking arrangement as a contributing factor. CEO Kieran Burke later acknowledged in 2014 that big offers pouring in for the land made more sense to close. The 104-acre property in the inner loop of Houston had become extremely valuable real estate. The land was sold in June 2006 for $77 million to help offset Six Flags' rising debt load. The final day, October 30th, 2005, drew massive crowds. Houstonians who had grown up at the park showed up to ride the rides one last time and to stand in line for a wooden roller coaster one more time as adults. Some brought their kids, some cried. The Texas Cyclone ran until it was done running. The rides were auctioned in January and February of 2006 and dispersed to parks across the country. The Thunder River Raft Ride, which Astroworld had pioneered, was relocated. The Texas Cyclone was demolished. There was no buyer and no practical way to move a wooden roller coaster of that size. The buildings came down, the parking bridge over Loop 610, the bridge that visitors had crossed from the parking lot into the park, was the only structure left standing, and it remains there today, connecting a field to another field. The land sold for $77 million was never developed. A deal for luxury condominiums fell through. A subsequent proposal also stalled. Nothing was ever built on the former park site. It became a parking lot for an event at another venue. That is the complete return on investment for the city of Houston and the generations of families who spent their summers there. Travis Scott, who grew up in Houston, named his 2018 studio album Astroworld in tribute to the park. He told XXL Magazine, "They took Astroworld away from us in Houston." The album debuted at number 1. The grass field remains. Part 3, Six Flags, New Orleans, abandoned by everything. The story of Six Flags New Orleans is one of the stranger chapters in American amusement park history, partly because the park should never have existed in the first place, and partly because what happened to it was both inevitable and completely unforeseeable. The park opened as Jazzland in May 2000, the product of nearly a decade of failed investment partnerships and creative use of federal housing money that the city of New Orleans eventually became liable for when the original operator went bankrupt. It was built on 220 acres of swampland east of the city on a concrete platform 4 feet thick, a necessary engineering measure because New Orleans sits below sea level. Themed areas celebrated Louisiana culture. A wooden roller coaster called the Mega Zeph was built on a steel frame rather than wood, specifically to resist termite infestation and hurricane-force winds. Somebody had thought ahead about the hurricane part. After the original operator went bankrupt in 2002, purchased the lease for $22 million and invested $20 million in upgrades, shade structures, Warner Brothers-themed rides, corporate branding. The park reopened as Six Flags New Orleans in 2003. It was never profitable. It ranked among Six Flags' lowest-performing properties, and the company was already quietly considering what to do with underperforming assets when Hurricane Katrina made landfall on August 25, 2005. The park staff had closed for the weekend on August 21st and had no time to secure anything before the storm. The levees failed. New Orleans flooded on a catastrophic scale. The park took on approximately 6 feet of standing water that sat for weeks. Metal ride structures corroded. Electrical wiring dissolved. Wooden structures swelled and warped. The park's concrete platform, the 4-foot foundation that had kept it above the swamp, held, but everything built on top of it did not. Buildings were infiltrated by mold that grew in the subtropical heat once the water receded. When investigators walked the property afterward, the park looked less like something that had been damaged and more like something that had been submerged and then abandoned mid-afternoon, which is exactly what it was, because it had closed for a regular weekend and no one had ever come back to open it again. Six Flags declared the property a total loss. The company attempted to recover $150 million from its insurers, but most policies specifically excluded flood damage. Already in the early stages of what would become its 2009 bankruptcy, the company could not justify rebuilding a low-performing park. The lease was terminated in 2009, with Six Flags paying the city $3 million as part of the settlement. For nearly 2 decades, the park sat completely abandoned. Roller coaster frames jutted above the overgrowth. Faded Looney Tunes characters decayed on concession stand walls. Alligators and feral boars moved in. Urban explorers documented it extensively. The mold-covered Bugs Bunny signs, the tilted ride structures, the empty streets frozen at the moment of evacuation, and the images circulated widely for years. Demolition finally began in November 2024. A redevelopment plan approved in 2023 is underway. For 19 years, those frames visible from the highway were a daily reminder to returning residents that some things were not going to be restored. Part 4. The Haunted Castle. Six Flags' Darkest Day. On May 11, 1984, a warm Friday evening in New Jersey, approximately 29 people were inside the haunted castle at Six Flags Great Adventure in Jackson Township. The haunted castle was a walk-through attraction, a structure built from 17 linked semi-trailers with a fake castle facade bolted onto the outside. Narrow corridors filled with flammable decorations, costumed employees jumping out at visitors, actors in ghoul costumes lurking in darkened corners. The whole interior was lined with plywood paneling, 2x4 wood framing, foam rubber pads on the walls, and paper and fabric decorations. It was, in other words, a very large box of kindling. Because it was built on a series of connected trailers, it was technically classified as a temporary structure, which meant it was not subject to the same building codes as permanent attractions. No building permit had been issued for its construction. A certificate of occupancy had never been obtained. The attraction had been in operation for 6 years, long past any reasonable definition of temporary, but the regulatory classification stuck. No working smoke detectors, no fire sprinklers, and despite advice from safety consultants, documented advice that the prosecution would later place in front of a jury, nothing had changed. At 6:35 p.m., someone inside the attraction, later identified through witness accounts as a teenager who has never been publicly named, used a cigarette lighter to see down a darkened corridor where a strobe light had malfunctioned. The lighter touched a foam rubber wall pad. The foam caught. The fire spread in seconds through the connected trailers, fed by the ventilation from the air conditioning system. From outside the castle, witnesses described smoke rising and then flames leaping 100 feet in the air. One bystander, Peter Berkery, told the New York Times, "I saw security guards running and parents running and an incredible amount of smoke rising toward the sky. At first, the smoke was coming out of the top, and then it began to pour out of the haunted house front door. Most of the visitors inside made it out. One group of 9 teenagers did not. 8 of them, ranging in age from 15 to 19, were found in a corridor near what they had believed was an exit. It was a closet door. Disoriented by smoke and darkness, they had followed the wrong passageway. All 8 died from carbon monoxide poisoning and smoke inhalation. They were so badly burned that firefighters initially believed the figures they found were mannequins. Their names: Jose Carrion Jr., Eric Rodriguez, Lenny Ruiz, Samuel Valentin Jr., Christopher Harrison, Nicola Cayazza, Suzette Elliott, and Tina Genovese. 5 of them had been students at Franklin K. Lane High School in New York City. Suzette Elliott and Tina Genovese had won their trip to the park by collecting Campbell's soup can labels at their school, a prize from a school fundraiser. They were all within 25 feet of a fire exit when they died. Six Flags, Great Adventure, and its parent company were indicted on charges of aggravated manslaughter. The prosecution presented evidence that safety consultants had repeatedly warned the park to install sprinklers and smoke alarms in the attraction, and that those warnings had been ignored. Park officials testified that smoke detectors had originally been installed, but were repeatedly vandalized, and the park had chosen not to reinstall them after 1979, 5 years before the fire. After an 8-week trial and 13 hours of deliberation, the jury acquitted both companies of the criminal charges, finding in part that the regulatory gap created by the temporary structure classification had distributed responsibility in ways that made criminal culpability difficult to assign to any single party. After the verdict, Dan P. Howell, president of Six Flags Corporation, said at a news conference, "We believe we were in compliance with all the codes. We believe we took the necessary steps to protect the public, but the tragedy happened anyway." 7 of the 8 families settled civil suits for $2.5 million each. The 8th family went to trial and was awarded $750,000. The ride operated as normal the same evening. The Dutch rock band Golden Earring performed as scheduled. The haunted castle was demolished. New Jersey passed new fire safety laws for dark ride attractions in the aftermath. Other states followed. The regulatory gap that allowed the haunted castle to exist without sprinklers or working smoke alarms was permanently closed. The park kept going. The brand kept growing. Part 5, the debt cycle that wouldn't end. When Six Flags emerged from its 2010 bankruptcy, the playbook was straightforward. Cut costs, reduce debt, invest in the parks that were actually working, and stop trying to be everything to everyone. Under CEO Jim Reed Anderson, who took over in August 2010, the strategy largely worked for several years. Long-term debt dropped from $2.5 billion in 2007 to around $918 million by March 2012. Rather than spending $204 million on interest expense as it had in 2007, Six Flags was paying $61 million annually by 2012, freeing up significant cash for park improvements. New rides were added on a more disciplined cycle. Food and beverage revenue improved, and guest satisfaction scores climbed. The parks were cleaner and better maintained than they had been at the height of the debt era. For a few years, Six Flags genuinely looked like a successful corporate turnaround, the kind that gets taught in business school. The company became focused on what it called a capital-light strategy, licensing the Six Flags brand to international developers who would build and operate parks using the name and the intellectual property, with Six Flags collecting fees and royalties without having to put up construction capital itself. It was elegant on paper. It also meant the company's earnings became partly dependent on partners in markets it did not control, did not fully understand, and could not compel to perform. Then the model shifted into China in a very big way. By the late 2010s, Six Flags had announced partnerships to build parks across China in a joint venture with a real estate developer called Riverside Investment Group. At peak announcement velocity, there were plans for 11 parks across various Chinese cities. 2 had actually broken ground: Six Flags Zhejiang, near Shanghai, and Six Flags Chongqing, with projected opening dates in 2020. Revenue from licensing fees and royalties was being factored into Six Flags' financial projections before either park had opened or come anywhere close to welcoming a single guest. Stock analysts were building forward earnings models around projected Chinese attendance figures for parks that existed only in construction permits and press releases. On January 10, 2020, Six Flags disclosed publicly that Riverside Investment Group had defaulted on its payment obligations and that the China projects had encountered continued challenges and has not progressed as expected. The announcement triggered a 19% single-day drop in Six Flags stock to its lowest level in 5 years. The company simultaneously disclosed expected charges of approximately $10 million related to the China write-downs in Q4 2019. In February 2020, Six Flags formally terminated all its Chinese projects. The partially constructed Zhejiang site was eventually taken over by a Chinese developer and rebranded. The Chongqing project was similarly transferred. Six Flags walked away with losses, write-downs, a class action lawsuit from investors alleging the company had misled them on China's progress, and nothing else. Meanwhile, COVID-19 closed every park in the company's portfolio in spring 2020. Roller coasters do not generate revenue when nobody is allowed to ride them. The company borrowed to survive. By the end of the pandemic disruption, Six Flags' balance sheet had deteriorated to the point where management was exploring strategic alternatives, which is the corporate euphemism for "we're not sure we can fix this on our own." In November 2023, Cedar Fair, Six Flags' biggest domestic competitor, announced a merger with the battered Six Flags Company. The deal was described as a merger of equals, which was generous to Six Flags. Cedar Fair's shareholders ended up with a 51.2% controlling stake, and Cedar Fair's CEO, Richard Zimmerman, became the CEO of the combined company. The combined entity, trading under the ticker FUN, became the largest regional amusement park operator in North America. The Six Flags name survived, applied to the combined company. The independent Six Flags, the one that started in Texas in 1961, effectively ceased to exist as its own entity on July 1st, 2024. As of Q1 2025, the merged company carried $5.25 billion in long-term debt. The ride is still going. Part 6. What's still being lost? The downfall of Six Flags didn't end cleanly with the 2009 bankruptcy or the 2024 merger. Parks kept closing on the way down and after, and the pattern of communities losing something they'd built their summers around continued without much sentimentality from the corporate level. Six Flags, Kentucky Kingdom in Louisville, had been a fixture on the Kentucky State Fairgrounds since the 1980s. Six Flags closed it in 2009 during the bankruptcy proceedings, when the Kentucky State Fair Board refused to amend the lease on the company's terms. The Fair Board was not willing to extend Six Flags' favorable lease arrangement, while the company was simultaneously filing for bankruptcy protection. The park sat dark and unused for 5 years. It reopened in 2014 under completely new ownership, rebranded simply as Kentucky Kingdom, with new management that invested in the property and operated it as an independent regional park. It operates today without any affiliation to Six Flags. The brand that closed it didn't save it. Someone else who actually wanted to run a theme park did. Six Flags America in Bowie, Maryland, located between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, had operated since 1982, originally as a Wild World water park before being converted and expanded into a full-scale theme park that Six Flags took over in 1999. It served the Washington metropolitan area for decades, one of the densest population corridors in the country. At the end of the 2025 season, on November 2, 2025, the park closed permanently. The new post-merger company announced the closure as part of a portfolio review, with CEO Richard Zimmerman stating that Six Flags America and its adjacent Hurricane Harbor Water Park were not a strategic fit with the company's long-term growth plan. Hurricane Harbor closed first on September 6, 2025. Six Flags America followed 2 months later. A park that had operated for over 35 years, that had been the summer destination for generations of families across the Mid-Atlantic region, was struck from the portfolio in a press release. The company said the property would be redeveloped. No specific plans had been announced as of the closure date. The Auto World Park in Flint, Michigan, deserves a brief mention here as well. A cautionary example that predates the worst of Six Flags' debt era. Auto World was an indoor theme park that opened in Flint in 1984 with $70 million in public funding, designed to revitalize the struggling post-industrial city by turning its automotive heritage into a tourist attraction. It closed in 1985, 1 year after opening, because it failed to attract enough out-of-town visitors. It continued to host occasional events until being demolished in 1997. It was briefly operated under a Six Flags banner during its short existence. It is remembered, where it is remembered at all, as an example of what happens when a city uses a theme park to solve a problem that a theme park cannot solve. These aren't footnotes in a corporate history. For the workers who had jobs at these parks and the communities that organized their summers around them, each closure represented something concrete being removed from their lives without replacement. A regional theme park is not a luxury item for most of its audience. For a family that cannot afford a week at Disney World, it is often the vacation they actually take. When the economics stopped working, those families were not considered with particular care in the financial calculus. The history of Six Flags is, in part, a history of parks being used as financial assets to service debt, rather than as destinations worth sustaining for the communities built around them. The debt outlasted the parks it was supposed to fund. That's the part of the story that doesn't get cleaned up in a bankruptcy filing or a merger announcement. And that is the story of the downfall of Six Flags parks. Closures, debt, and tragedy. A company that started with one genuinely good idea in Texas in 1961 and spent the next 6 decades either growing too fast, borrowing too much, or absorbing the consequences of both. 8 teenagers who didn't make it out of a haunted house that had been built without sprinklers or working smoke alarms and classified as temporary for 6 years, so it wouldn't have to comply with building codes. 2 cities, Houston and New Orleans, that lost parks in completely different ways and for completely different reasons, and that are still waiting for something to fill those spaces. One company that went bankrupt in 2009, emerged leaner, borrowed its way back to the edge, merged with a competitor, and is now carrying $5.25 billion in combined debt while closing more parks. The people who built their summers around these parks are still out there. The workers who staffed the rides and the families who drove the same highway exit every July for 20 years don't get a merger press release explaining that their experience was not a strategic fit. They just find out that something is gone, and then they figure out where else to go. If you made it all the way through, Hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely supports the channel, and we put real time into tracking these stories down and getting the facts straight. Drop a comment below with the park you grew up going to, or the one you think deserved better. There are more of these stories than anyone likes to admit. We'll see you in the next one.